The decision had nothing to do with loyalty. That was the first thing Dale Wentz said when his neighbor asked him why he had traded his John Deere 8R for a Massey Ferguson 8S.265. And it was the truest thing he said in a conversation that lasted 20 minutes and covered ground that Dale had been covering in his own head for 4 years. He had no particular feeling about either brand. He had run John Deere equipment for 22 years because John Deere equipment had been available, competent, and supported by a dealer network that had been adequate for the work he needed done. He had run it without sentiment and without the kind of brand attachment that some farmers develop across decades of operating the same color of equipment. He had tracked its costs in notebooks since 2008 and had watched those costs move in a direction that, by 2022, had crossed a threshold he had set for himself when he began keeping the records. The threshold was simple. When the per-hour operating cost on a machine exceeded what Dale's comparison data suggested a comparable machine should cost, the machine was a candidate for replacement. When the dealer relationship that supported the machine showed a pattern of service gaps that were costing him operational time he could not recover, the combination of the two factors made the replacement decision not a question of loyalty, but a question of arithmetic. Dale was a man of arithmetic. He had been a man of arithmetic his entire farming life, which was now 43 years long, and which had been conducted on 2,800 acres of corn and soybeans in Benton County, Iowa, with the specific focus of a man who understood that the difference between a farming operation that survived and one that did not was rarely dramatic and almost always numerical. He had started the comparison in the spring of 2022. Not a casual comparison, a structured one, built on the same methodology he used for every equipment evaluation, which was to collect the same categories of data from both sides of the comparison and apply the same analytical framework to both. The methodology had been developed across 17 years of keeping operating records and had been refined each time he had used it, so that by 2022 it covered 11 specific categories of cost and performance data that Dale considered the minimum necessary to make an equipment decision with confidence. On the John Deere side, he had 4 years of operating records on his 8R 340, fuel consumption by season and by field application, repair costs by machine and by event, parts wait times logged from his service records every time he had contacted the dealer about a parts situation, labor rate history with the dates and amounts of each rate change, and his own rolling estimate of the machine's resale trajectory based on regional auction data he had been tracking at 2 sale barns since 2019. He also had 4 years of records on the dealer relationship itself, scheduling response times, the dates and outcomes of the 3 service gaps he had experienced, his own assessment of the technician continuity on his account, and the one direct conversation with the dealer principal in which he had raised his parts availability concerns and received a response that he had characterized in his notebook as cordial and unproductive. On the Massey Ferguson side, he had no operating records of his own, which meant he had to build the comparison from external sources with the same rigor he would have applied to internal data. He contacted 11 farmers through the County Farm Bureau network and the Iowa State Extension contacts he had accumulated across 40 years. Farmers who had been running Massey Ferguson equipment of comparable class to the 8R in comparable field applications for at least 3 years, who were willing to share their operating data directly rather than through a dealer's summary, and whose operations he knew well enough to assess the reliability of their record keeping. 9 of the 11 responded with usable data. He collected fuel consumption figures, repair cost totals, parts wait times, and their assessments of the dealer relationship quality in specific terms. He also pulled fuel consumption data from 2 independent field comparison studies he located through agricultural publications, resale value data from 2 regional sale barns covering the previous 3 years of MF8S series transactions, and a direct conversation with the Massey Ferguson dealer in Vinton about parts availability and service response capacity on accounts of his size. The dealer's name was Art Pelham. Dale had called him on a Tuesday morning in March and explained what he was doing. Not shopping, not ready to buy, building a comparison and wanting accurate information on specific questions. He had a list of 8 questions written on the same yellow legal pad he used for all his equipment evaluations, and he read them to Art in order and waited for answers before moving to the next one. Art had answered all 8 directly, including the one about his dealership's performance when it failed to meet a service commitment, an answer that described 2 instances in the previous 3 years, what had caused them, and what had been done to address the affected customers. Dale had written Art's answer to that question in full in his notebook because it was the most useful answer he received from any dealer in the comparison process. And the most useful answer was not the one that painted the best picture, but the one that told him something true about how a dealer behaved when the situation was not ideal. Art had also offered to provide documentation on the parts availability question, his actual order logs from the previous 2 years, showing lead times on the components that mattered most to an operation of Dale's type, with the customer identifiers replaced by account numbers. Dale had said he would appreciate the documentation. Art had emailed it that afternoon. Dale had spent 2 evenings going through the logs and building a summary table of lead times by component category that he could compare directly to his own John Deere wait time records. Dale had spent 3 weeks going through the full comparison before he was satisfied that the data was complete enough to support a conclusion. He had built a 10-year cost of ownership projection on both sides, using conservative assumptions that he had stress-tested against his own 4-year operating data to confirm they were not optimistic. The Massey Ferguson advantage on projected operating costs over 10 years, under his conservative assumptions, was $47,000. Under his optimistic assumptions, which he did not use for decisions, it was higher. Under his pessimistic assumptions, which he used to check whether the decision survived adversity, it was $31,000. He had never made an equipment decision based on an optimistic scenario, and he was not going to start now. He had also built a comparison on the dealer relationship question, which was harder to quantify, but which Dale had attempted to quantify anyway, because a man who tracks per-hour operating costs does not exempt the unquantifiable from the accounting simply because it resists easy measurement. He had documented 3 service gaps in the previous 18 months at his John Deere dealer, 2 parts wait times that had exceeded what the situation warranted, and 1 scheduling delay that had pushed a pre-season service into a window that made him uncomfortable, and had estimated the operational cost of each gap in terms of the risk it had created, even where no actual harvest loss had resulted. He had also built a comparison from Art Pelham's parts lead time logs against his own John Deere wait time records. The comparison was not close, and not close in the direction that mattered. Pelham's documented lead times were consistently shorter on the categories of components that had produced Dale's longest John Deere waits. He had signed the purchase agreement in June and had taken delivery of the MF8S265 in August, in time to run it through the tail end of the summer fieldwork and the full harvest season before the first winter maintenance interval. He had started a new notebook on the day of delivery, the same format he had used for every machine since 2008, the same categories, the same discipline, the same daily logging habit that had produced the 4 years of Deere data that had made the comparison possible. He had not expected to be surprised by the year 1 numbers. He had built a projection. He had stress-tested the projection. He had run it through scenarios that assumed the Massey Ferguson advantage was smaller than he expected, and scenarios that assumed the John Deere dealer's service had been worse than his records showed. He had arrived at a range of first-year outcomes that he considered realistic and had calibrated his expectations accordingly. When he sat at his kitchen table in early December and totaled the first season's data, he expected to see numbers that fell within the range he had projected. The fuel consumption came in at the low end of his projected range, better than the conservative estimate and consistent with the operator reports he had used to build the comparison. He noted it without particular satisfaction, because a single data point that falls within a projected range is confirmation of methodology rather than a result, and Dale did not celebrate the confirmation of methodology. The parts availability data was clean. One service call across the full season, a sensor replacement in September that Art Pelham's dealership had resolved in 31 hours from initial contact to machine back in service. Dale wrote the 31 hours in his notebook, the same way he had written every part's wait time in his John Deere records, specifically with the date and the part and the cause. He did not compare it to his worst John Deere experience or his best. He added it to the record. The repair cost for the season was $340, lower than any comparable period on the 8R, but he expected that, because new machines in their first season tend to run clean, and the comparison would not be meaningful until 3 or 4 seasons of data had accumulated. He noted it and weighted it accordingly. These were the numbers he had expected. What he had not expected was the column in his notebook that covered maintenance compliance. Dale had always maintained his equipment on schedule. He believed in maintenance scheduling the way he believed in crop insurance, not because it was exciting, but because the cost of not doing it was always higher than the cost of doing it, and the only question was whether you paid the cost up front or paid it later with interest. He had maintained the 8R on schedule for 9 years. His records showed it. Every oil change, every filter, every fluid service, every grease interval, all of it documented on the dates it was supposed to occur within a window that he considered acceptable. When he went through the Year 1 maintenance records on the MF8S 265 and compared them to the same period on the 8R in its first year, he found something he had not been looking for. The intervals were tighter, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible to a casual observer or that represented a categorical difference in approach, but measurably. The 8S 265's oil changes had averaged 3 hours earlier in the interval than the 8Rs had in its first year. The filter replacements had been done at the first sign of restriction rather than at the end of the recommended interval. The grease schedule had been met without exception at a compliance rate that his records showed was slightly above his own historical average. He sat with this for a while before he understood what he was looking at. He had been more attentive to the new machine's maintenance than he had been to the established machine's maintenance. Not dramatically more attentive. He was a disciplined man, and the difference was not between negligent and careful. It was between careful and more careful. And when he looked for the reason, he found it in something he had not included in his pre-switch comparison because he had not known to include it. Art Pelham had called him 4 times in the first season. Not to sell anything. To check in, once before the first major field application to ask whether Dale had any questions about the machine's configuration for his specific tillage setup, once at mid-season to ask how the machine was performing and whether Dale had noted anything that needed attention before harvest, once before the harvest push to confirm the machine had been through its pre-harvest inspection and that Dale knew the emergency contact protocol, and once in early November to schedule the post-harvest service visit. 4 calls across 1 season. Dale had not received 4 proactive calls from his John Deere dealer in the previous 4 years combined. What the calls had done, and this was the part Dale had not projected because he had not known it would happen, was change the texture of his relationship with the machine. A farmer who receives a proactive call from his dealer asking whether the machine is ready for the harvest push is a farmer who thinks about whether the machine is ready for the harvest push with a different quality of attention than a farmer who does not receive that call. Dale had always thought about whether his machines were ready. The calls had made him think about it more specifically, more early, and with the implicit accountability of a relationship in which someone else was also paying attention. He sat with this for a long time before he wrote anything down, because he wanted to be certain he was recording an observation rather than a rationalization. A man who makes a decision and then looks for evidence that the decision was correct is a man who will find the evidence he is looking for and call it data, which is not the same thing as data. Dale was aware of this risk, and had been aware of it since early in his farming career when he had made an equipment decision based partly on what he wanted to be true and had paid for it in a specific and educational way that he did not intend to repeat. He sat with the maintenance compliance observation and asked himself whether it was real or whether he was seeing it because he wanted the switch to have produced an advantage he had not projected. He concluded it was real. The notebook was specific on the dates and intervals. The historical average was calculated from 17 years of records and was not a memory or an impression. The difference between the year 1 compliance rate on the 8S265 and his historical average was not dramatic, but it was consistent. Every maintenance category showed tighter compliance, which meant it was not a random variation in one area, but a systematic difference across the full maintenance program. Systematic differences had causes, and the cause he identified was the 4 calls. He wrote this in his notebook in the language he used for everything. Specific, without embellishment, with the methodology stated and its limitations acknowledged. He wrote that the maintenance compliance rate on the 8S.265 in year 1 was measurably higher than his historical average, and that he attributed the difference in part to the proactive contact from the dealer, which had created an accountability structure that his previous dealer relationship had not provided. He noted that this was a behavioral effect of the dealer relationship rather than a mechanical effect of the equipment, and that it was not captured in his pre-switch cost comparison because he had not known to look for it, and that the failure to capture it in the pre-switch comparison was a gap in his methodology that he would address in future comparisons by including dealer contact frequency as a variable. He called Art Pelham in December and told him what the year 1 numbers showed. Art listened without interrupting. When Dale finished, Art said he appreciated Dale sharing the data and that the maintenance compliance observation was something he had seen in other accounts that had made the transition from dealers with less proactive contact structures, that the calls changed behavior, and the changed behavior showed up in the maintenance records within the first year. He said he had not been able to quantify it before in the way Dale's notebooks allowed it to be quantified, and that he would appreciate Dale's permission to reference the observation, without identifying Dale, in conversations with accounts that were evaluating similar decisions. Dale said Art could use the observation. He said the data was what it was, and he had no interest in keeping it private. Art asked whether Dale wanted to discuss the second-year comparison parameters. Dale said he had already built them, the same categories, updated assumptions where the year 1 data had changed them. He said he was building a 4-year data set before he considered the comparison complete, because a single machine in 4 years of documented operation was the minimum basis for a fleet decision. Art said that was the right approach, and that he appreciated Dale telling him so directly, because it meant the year 2 conversation would be about data. Dale said that was exactly right, and that satisfaction was not a category in his notebook. Art said he had worked with a lot of farmers across 14 years of owning the dealership, and that Dale's approach to the evaluation was the most systematic he had encountered. Dale said it was the only approach he knew. He said a man who made equipment decisions based on how he felt about a brand was a man who would eventually pay for it, and that he had seen it happen to neighbors across 43 years of farming and had decided early that he was not going to be one of them. He went back to his notebook. The year 1 total was in, the fuel numbers, the parts numbers, the repair numbers, the maintenance compliance numbers, the behavioral effect he had not projected. He added a column he had not included in the original comparison framework, a column for what he called relationship effect, which was his attempt to quantify the impact of Art Pelham's 4 calls on his maintenance compliance rate and the downstream cost implications of that compliance rate over the machine's projected service life. The number was imprecise in the way that behavioral effects are always imprecise, but it was not 0 and it was not negligible, and leaving it out of the accounting would have made the accounting incomplete. He wrote the number down. He wrote a note beside it explaining the methodology and its limitations. He put the notebook back on the shelf above his workbench in the sequence with the others, 17 years of operating records on every machine he had run since he started keeping them in 2008. The Year 2 notebook was already started. The first entries were from the fall service visit. Art Pelham's technician, 2 hours, full post-harvest inspection, 1 hydraulic fitting flagged for monitoring. Dale had written the flagged fitting in the notebook with the technician's name and the specific location and the monitoring criteria the technician had described. He had added it to the preseason checklist for the following spring. He had not needed to be reminded to add it. The technician had documented it, which meant Dale's notebook had it, which meant it would not be overlooked. That was how it worked when the relationship was functioning correctly. Information moved from the machine to the technician, to the notebook, to the checklist, to the action. No gap in the chain. No item that fell through because nobody was paying attention to the connection between one step and the next. Dale Wendt was 68 years old. He had been farming Benton County for 43 years. He had switched his primary tillage tractor to Massey Ferguson to save $47,000 over 10 years under conservative assumptions. The Year 1 numbers had confirmed the fuel and parts assumptions within their projected ranges. What he had not projected was the 4 phone calls. What he had not projected was what 4 phone calls from a dealer who was paying attention changed about how a disciplined farmer with 17 years of notebooks and 43 years of discipline maintained a machine he was already maintaining carefully. The numbers were in the notebook. The notebook was on the shelf. Year 2 had started. Dale was already paying attention. He had always been paying attention. The difference was that now someone else was paying attention with him.